Okay, good morning and good Friday to all of you. Sadly, we are heading to the end of the conference, and I'm glad to introduce this final session on such a fascinating topic that is FX interventions. First of all, I'd like to welcome the participants of this session and also set up the rules for it. So for each of the three panels, speakers will have 20 minutes, commentators 8 minutes, and after that, we'll have a 6-minute slot for questions from the audience, right? And considerations from the speaker to the response from the commentators if there is any remark, right? So 20, 8, and 6 minutes, so we conclude each panel, right? Well, intervening in FX markets is a challenge, not only for policymakers, but also for the academic world, given that they are constantly struggling with poor transparency and lack of available information on FX intervention from central banks in their websites. But I must say that this is not the case of the Central Bank of Brazil, where as we are one of the most transparent central banks in the world among the central bank community, when it comes to communication related to FX intervention and also data release on such data. In that regard, I would like to make a very brief propaganda on this open data launch that we did earlier this year, January 2013. Where you will find a vast data set of our interventions since January 1999. So you see there the link, and here you can make this filter. This is going to be available for all of you after this session. And this version is only available in Portuguese, but English version is coming soon. So I invite everyone here to visit and really encourage everyone to explore this amazing data set of FX interventions to enhance and to allow you to go deep in your research on FX interventions, right? That said, in order to shed further lights in the effectiveness of FX interventions conducted by a selected group of central banks, mostly from emerging markets, I would like to invite, as a speaker for the first panel, Mr. Freddy Pinzon Puerto from CEMLA and Universidad del Rosario, and as commentator, Mr. Andrés Sanchez Jaba from Banco de la República de Colombia to make his comments, okay? Let me open the presentation here. What is yours, Freddy?
Yeah, so hello everybody. So thanks to organizers for having me here. So this paper is entitled "Do Actions Speak Louder Than Words?" and a foreign exchange intervention analysis. It's a joint work with Mauricio Villamizar from the Central Bank of Colombia. And of course, the usual disclaimer applies here. So first of all, wait a minute. My vision is not so good. So we aim to answer two questions. So first of all, what's the difference in exchange rate effects between the FX announcements and the secret interventions? But we also want to measure how do central bank credibility, FX volatility, and also FX risk factors affect the foreign exchange intervention effectiveness. So for those of you who are not very familiar with the topic, the FX intervention is no more than the purchase and sale of dollars made by the monetary authorities in order to influence the exchange rate. So as identification strategy, we use fuzzy and sharp regression discontinuity designs, exploiting a rule-based mechanism enacted by the Central Bank of Colombia. And our findings, are that unconditionally both announcements and secret interventions carry similar effects, but these effects, the effects of announcements are considerably amplified, conditional on higher central bank credibility, less frequent announcements, and also episodes of higher effects volatility. So now, just as motivation, let me start by saying that in empirical literature, there is a general lack of consensus regarding the effectiveness of central bank intervention. So here I listed 3 surveys, and they all have in common that slightly half of the studies find significant effects. So the absence of consensus is not surprising given the mixed goals and also the country heterogeneity, but also because isolating effects intervention effectiveness is empirically challenging due to endogeneity issues. So, but despite the challenges, valuable progress has been made in synthesizing the lessons learned. However, one issue has eluded most of the empirical literature, that is the difference in exchange rate effects between announcement and secret interventions. And among the papers that have attempted this endeavor are just there, all of which compare discretionary mechanisms with a pre-announced mechanism. But yeah, the issue that may arise here is the fact that these mechanisms could differ in ways that may affect also the exchange rate. And also, usually, the authors compare these 2 mechanisms using different methodologies. So this make the comparability much less straightforward. So our contribution of this paper is to this debate is to compare announcement and also secret interventions by contrasting both, but using the exact effects intervention mechanism, the same identification strategy under the same context, but with just one difference. Some interventions were announced and some other were unannounced. So now let me explain the identification strategy. So basically, we take advantage of an intervention mechanism enacted by the Central Bank of Colombia between 2000 and 2012. That this graph here shows more or less how it operates. So in the figure, you see like the gray line is just the exchange rate, and the gray line is surrounded by a green band, and this band is defined by the exchange rate moving average plus minus 4%. So the idea was that every time the gray line, that is the exchange rate, surpasses the band, then the rule was triggered for either sales or dollars via put options or call options. The upper bound was for call options and the lower bound was for put options. If the rule was triggered, then the central bank issued a 180 million US dollars in put or call options. And after that, the market participants were able to exercise their options as long as the rule was triggered. So this was also a necessary condition for that. So from this setting, we can separate between 2 different effects. One is the issuance of options, which we take as the FX intervention announcement. Why? Because the issuance is no more than the emission of options, and also all the information was completely available and public to the market participants. But also we can measure the effects of the exercise, which we take as the operative effects. Basically, because the exercise of options is what in fact yields the central bank to purchase or sell dollars. So that's why we take this operative as operative effects. Then in this graph that you see behind, we present the same information as before, but we here normalize everything in order to have a fixed upper bound and lower bound to 1 and -1. So under this definition, the black line represents the running variable. And every time the running variable surpasses the 1, then the rule was triggered for sales. But if it surpasses the -1, then the rule was triggered for purchases. And our method or our intuition here is based on a regression discontinuity. So if you focus on just around the observations surrounding the triggering threshold, you will find that random factors or exchange rate surprises determine whether on a certain day the rule was triggered or not, right? So in fact, what we have here is more or less a localized quasi-experiment. So then we can identify the effects of FX intervention by comparing observations just around the triggering threshold, right? So now let me explain you why. Well, we have two effects, as I said, the effects of the exercise of options and the issuance of options. Again, the exercise are the operative effects of intervention. Here we face a fuzzy regression discontinuity design. Why? Because whenever the rule was triggered, this didn't necessarily imply the exercise of options. Why? Because traders could have chosen to exercise their options, but were not required to. So this is up to intermediaries. So then we implement a two-stage least square procedure to find effects of the exercise of options. Then regarding the effects of issuing options, we face a sharp regression discontinuity design. Why? Because we have two conditions in order to issue options for the central bank, and these two conditions could be implemented under a single definition of running variable that deterministically and perfectly determines whether the central bank did intervene or not, right? So this yields to a sharp regression discontinuity design. Then, so let me show you here some of our results. So this table shows the effects on the exchange rate level and the exchange rate volatility for put options, that is purchases, or call options for sales, and we distinguish between the issuance and the exercise. So in the case of put options, we find that, for put options, we find that in the case of the level, we find more or less a depreciation effect of 1% in the exchange rate level, defined as the COP over US dollars. And the effect is really similar, 1% almost. And in the case of volatility, which is defined as the distance relative to the moving average, we find a decrease in 1 percentage point, more or less. Regarding the sales of dollars, we find non-significant effects for the case of the exercise of options, but for the issuance of options, we find a depreciation effect of 0.3%, and this is the opposite sign as expected. So our explanation to this is the fact that is the tendency of the Central Bank of Colombia to do purchase intervention via discretionary mechanisms just around the call auction. So once we exclude these episodes where the central bank decided to intervene via discretionary mechanisms, then this depreciation effect disappears. So now in this graph, you see like exactly the same information that I showed you before, but graphically. So the panel A shows the results for put options and the panel B for call options. So as the x-axis, you have the running variable, and the vertical line is in -1 for the case of put options. So you can see that crossing the triggering threshold to the left is related to an increase in the exchange rate level. And there, I don't know if it's very clear, but we are contrasting both the effects of the issuance and the exercise of options, and the effect is really similar. In contrast, for the case of call options, that is the panel B, we see that there is either a null or small but unexpected depreciation when the rule was triggered. When the rule was triggered, when we cross to the one threshold to the right, yeah. Well, then we extend our analysis to a 1 month horizon using local projections by Jorda. So this is moving forward, like the difference and keeping fixed the T-1. And here we contrast the effects of the exercise and issuance options. So the issuance is the red line, and the exercise is the blue line. So for put options in general, we find that after the central bank intervenes via the issuance of put options, the exchange rate depreciates by up to 2%, and the effects persist for up to more or less 15 days. And for the case of the exercise of options, the exchange rate depreciates by up to 4%, and these effects persist for around 20 days until the exchange rate reaches the pre-intervention level. So the effects are pretty similar, but in the first 10 days, but after that, then we see like that the effects of the exercise of options is a little bit larger. And regarding the call options, we find an overall null effect for the exercise of options, but for the issuance of options, we find a maximum depreciation of 4% more or less around the day 10. And again, as I said, as you can see at the beginning, there is a depreciation effect that is like an increase. But again, once we exclude from the analysis these discretionary periods of discretionary purchases, we find no depreciation effects, just the appreciation. Well, and then we now extend our analysis in order to observe what are the effects of amplifying coverage. So we evaluate whether the FX intervention is magnified in periods of central bank credibility. And here we have two measures: leaning with the wind policies, that is periods of monetary tightening accompanied by sales, or periods of monetary easing accompanied by purchases. But we also have anchoring in inflation expectations. That's the difference between the expectation of the agents and the inflation target. We also have some measures of FX volatility, that is the dispersion of the 1 month ahead and 12 month ahead exchange rate forecast made by the market agents. And finally, we have some FX risk factors. Here we have the MB index, the VIX index, the oil price volatility, and here we have, like the reference where we obtain the motivation to include that variables. So basically, to do this analysis, what we did was to interact our sharp and fuzzy regression discontinuity designs by adding some interaction terms with this coverage and the treatment coverage. And this table here shows more or less what our results. So just to recap, basically we find that all of these coverage in general generate an amplifying effect of the effectiveness of the intervention for both the issuance and the exercise, but the effect is larger for the issuance of options. So just as an example, if you see in the table, we have the emerging markets risk index, and at around day 20, around the day 15, we see an increase in the exchange rate when the central bank intervenes via purchases of around 3.6 percentage points compared to the exercise of options, which have an effect of 1.6 percentage points. And the intuition here is that basically, since there is like uncertainty and risk and volatility, the market agents decide to take less speculative decisions or to take to make arbitrage to avoid this risk and uncertainty. So this allows the FX intervention to work, like to have an effect more like a straightforward effect. So finally, just to recap, so the concluding remarks. So unconditionally, we find that both announcements and secret interventions carry similar effects. This is somewhat surprising, given that most of the literature hints towards the signaling channel, and the signaling channel is mainly focused on the announcements. So we here show or shed a light on the theoretical work that distinguishes between portfolio and signaling channels. But finally, yeah, the announcement are considerably amplified, conditional on central bank credibility, episodes of high FX intervention, episodes of high FX volatility and riskier FX factors. So in those cases, in general, the effects of announcements are amplified by roughly 1 to 2 percentage points, while the secret trades have either a smaller or null effect. So yeah, and finally I have a couple of minutes more, so I will show you the results of this is, so here in this slide, you see in the panel A, you have in the negative side, like the green bars are the sales, and the blue bars are the discretionary purchases of dollars. And as you can see, most of the time the call options were surrounded by discretionary purchases. So once we exclude these observations, we find what is depicted in the impulse response in the panel B, that is, there is no depreciation effect during the first week. So yeah, I think that's what I have. Again, thank you so much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Freddy. And Andres, please, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for the opportunity for commenting this paper. Freddie, I don't know if somebody sent you my slides, because you just touched on my comments. So I'll try to keep it brief. You already touched on some of those. Well, this paper is very interesting. It has a solid empirical strategy. It provides some valuable insights for FX practitioners that informs about the effectiveness of different foreign exchange intervention schemes. And as I mentioned, it has a thoughtful and very meticulous empirical strategy that advances our understanding of the causal effects of announced and secret trades. So let me briefly start by saying what this study does and providing a brief summary. It analyzes the differences in exchange rate effects of central bank announcements and secret trades in the foreign exchange markets in Colombia between 2002 and 2012. The identification strategy hinges on a rule-based intervention scheme that triggers the issuance, which the authors interpret as announcements, or the exercise, which the authors interpret as secret trades of FX options. The main result is that announcements and secret trades have similar effects on FX level and volatility. However, announcements have a considerably larger effect under high central bank credibility, episodes of elevated FX volatility, and riskier FX factors. So I only have 8 minutes, so I'm going to touch on 2 points which I think are worth discussing, and they might enhance the quality of the study. However, you already touched on some of those. The first one might be confounding effects, and basically the idea of separating the effects of announcements and secret trades from those resulting of the use of other foreign exchange intervention schemes. And one that particularly got my attention was the asymmetric effect, mainly the limited or unexpected effect of announcements or secret trades when looking at put options. So you already showed a little bit of evidence of this. During the study period, the Central Bank of Colombia used several foreign exchange schemes in the FX market. Here you see information that summarizes those interventions by mechanism. Positive values indicate purchases of US dollars, negative values indicate sales. The purchases are supposed to depreciate the local currency or should be consistent with the exercise or issuance of put options. The sales should be consistent with the exercise or issuance of call options. So during this time, particularly when you look at the period where most issuance or exercise of options took place, they mainly took place between 2006 and 2010, which is a period where, as you said, the Central Bank of Colombia was actively using discretionary foreign exchange intervention. And you do mention and touch on the point that you try to control for that, and when you control for that, then the unexpected result goes away. And I think that's very valuable, but maybe we can think a little bit about how to interpret this. Maybe provide a little bit more idea of how the possible overlap between the rule-based intervention mechanisms and discretionary foreign exchange interventions. It might be creating overstated results, because if that is the case, then you want to have a good idea of what that bias might be. In fact, as you see, there's different intervention mechanisms that took place, most of them consistent with the purchase of US dollars. And there's some evidence in the study, and you actually, the authors cite this in the study, there's evidence for Colombia that shows that on average, purchases in the amount of $1 billion depreciate the domestic currency by 3 to 5 percentage points. Well, this is a big impact. In fact, this impact is around 3 to 5 times the average effect found in the literature. So taking into account and considering that, purchases of US dollars, regardless of the exercise or the foreign exchange mechanism, do have a considerable impact on exchange rate behavior. You might want to give us more details, more information about what could be going on and how controlling for that actually favors or bolsters that identification of the effect you're looking for both type of intervention schemes. My suggestion would be, I think you could treat one of this factor as just an additional risk factor in your RDD. You could perform analysis for subperiods based on the foreign exchange intervention schemes used by the Central Bank of Colombia to have an idea of how the effect changes. For example, you can see that between 2006 and 2008, the use of discretionary interventions was big. However, towards the end of your sample, then there's mostly auctions for USD purchases. So if you look at specific periods, then you have a better flavor of how these results might be changing. And I think that's my main suggestion. Moving to the second point, this is the baseline result, and I think it's the punchline of the study. There's the effect of put options and call options. So for put options, you find what you expect, and it's exactly what we would like. Put options have an effect on the exchange rate level, regardless of whether that's the issuance or the exercise, approximately a 1% depreciation. And when we look at volatility, they reduce market volatility in approximately 1 percentage point. That's what you want. That's what you expect. However, when you look at call options, the baseline result tells us that there's no effect on volatility. And in fact, there's an unexpected depreciation of the Colombian peso of 3%, which of course, you guys argue that this could be explained by purchases through other foreign exchange mechanisms, particularly discretionary interventions. And in fact, in the appendix that you just saw, I hadn't seen that one before, but it's very valuable. It shows you that, yes, call options basically concentrate or cluster around those particular episodes of discretionary FX intervention. And that's certainly the case. And I'm saying that it's perfectly feasible. However, there's some evidence out there that reports on the asymmetric effect of macroeconomic announcements on foreign exchange markets, particularly statements intended to strengthen, and this is information, some findings for the euro area, but it might apply in this case. Some statements intended to strengthen or that support the euro exhibit limited success and even lead to higher market volatility. So this is not entirely unexpected. So it makes me wonder, so what's the motivation for looking at the call options if in the baseline result, we're not really finding anything or unexpected results? Maybe you could motivate this part a little bit better, especially because it's the case that you do find null effects, but also it's not entirely unexpected. So maybe try to make a better case for examining the call options separately, because with the put options, you do have the possibility of looking at both types of interventions which you want, which are announcements and secret trades. So those are my main comments. as I said, this is a great study. It advances our understanding of the causal effects of foreign exchange intervention by using an RDD approach that was tested thoroughly. There's multiple robustness checks and exercises. It provides empirical evidence that reinforces the importance of the signaling channel in foreign exchange intervention, particularly when you look at the amplified effect of the announcements relative to the secret trades. And it informs about the effectiveness of different foreign exchange intervention mechanisms and how economic conditions can affect this effectiveness. So I hope you can think about this, and looking forward to reading more about this in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Andres, for your comments. Now we open the floor for questions from the audience and also considerations from Freddie to Andres' remarks.
I'm taking a little bit of an issue with you calling it announcement versus. Effects intervention is that you should prioritize to the following.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for the paper. I'm wondering, is there any way you can, if you can distinguish those interventions that are responding to global shocks, the global, change in the global risk aversion versus interventions, that are not responding to those shocks? Because the reason why I'm saying is, there is this recent IMF framework, the integrated policy framework. They favor actually those interventions that are responding to global factors, right? But when it comes to domestic, if there's an issue, problem in the domestic economy, they say, no, you shouldn't do that. So I'm wondering if you can distinguish these two interventions and whether you see different results. And then the reason why it could be important is if it's responding to global forces, maybe markets might be anticipating in advance. That might also be interesting to look at. Yeah.
So nice paper. I have more of a methodological question about the discontinuity design approach. For a macroeconomic environment, you have a time series and you have expectations. And so as you get closer to the threshold, so people would expect the intervention to be more likely, right? And this, I think it might violate the assumptions of discontinuity design. I'm not sure about it, but I have this suspicion. Okay, so it's something for you to think about.
So I guess there are no more questions. So first, thank you so much for all the comments to Andres and for all your questions. So yeah, basically regarding you did mainly suggestions. Sorry for not sending the online appendix. That part was I didn't send that, but yeah, This is just our guess. Of course, what we are analyzing here is mainly or is entirely the rule-based mechanism, but we are aware that there exists some overlap with other mechanisms that the central bank used. So yeah, the way we find appropriate to deal with that was just simply to exclude these periods in order to see if something happens with the call options. And of course, because we have some few observations in the case of call options, then we decided to do this analysis under that front and not on the case of purchases. Well, regarding your comment, thank you. Yeah, I totally see your point. Yeah, our interpretation is that yeah, every time the central bank appears just to emit some new options, we take that just as an announcement, because for the market participants is just they have like a fixed like set of rules, and they know when how everything operates. The thing is, there is uncertainty about whether the rule is or is not going to be triggered. But yeah, we interpreted that just as an announcement, because the issuance of options is just the emission of the options to be held, and also because does not necessarily imply the purchase or sale of dollars. So that's why we take that as an announcement. Yeah, there was other comment about the effect of global factors. So thank you. Yeah, the way we are addressing that is just by adding some coverage that like occur like outside environment of Colombia. Like in somehow like Colombia do not have like a control regarding the way these coverage are operating. This is the case of the BICs or the MB or whatever. So this is the way we are addressing how global factors affect the FX intervention. And finally, yeah, your point is true. The thing is, our main argument is the randomness doesn't come from the fact that what the rule is, but when it's going to be triggered or not. So yeah, basically, as I said, if you are very close to the triggering threshold, you will see that some random factors or exchange rate surprises or the error component of the exchange rate for any reasons, some days is triggering is like pushing the exchange rate to surpass the triggering threshold, and in some days just simply not. So yeah, that's why this is like the core of our identification strategy. Yeah, but thank you so much for all the comments and suggestions.
Okay. So thanks for the great presentation and very fruitful discussion. So let's move to the second panel. I would like to invite Andres Sanchez to present his paper, and Yannick Timmer to be the commentator, right? Andres, the floor is yours. Let me put your presentation.
So thank you very much to the Banco Central do Brasil for organizing this fruitful conference. I really enjoyed the talks and the presentations and look forward to coming back next year. So this is joint work with Julian Parra Polania and Miguel Sarmiento, who are both researchers at the Central Bank of Colombia, and our studies titled "Are Oral Interventions in Foreign Exchange Markets Effective? Evidence from Emerging Markets." Usual disclaimers apply. All views and opinions and mistakes are my own and do not reflect the views of the Central Bank of Colombia or its Board of Governors. So before I get into the details, let me tell you what we do and what we find. We answer the question, what is the effect of oral interventions on the FX markets of Colombia and Mexico? We do so by analyzing statements and communications, which basically are oral interventions from monetary authorities between 2000 and 2019, testing if they have a significant effect on foreign exchange levels. Our main result is that we find an asymmetric effect of oral interventions on FX markets, particularly those that weaken the local currency affect the exchange rate level, while those that support the local currency are occasionally effective. So let me motivate this a little bit. The study of oral interventions is important because they enhance foreign exchange policy. For instance, in a seminal paper, Marcel Fratzer showed that oral interventions achieve a success rate of up to 75% in moving the exchange rate level in the intended direction and in limiting market volatility. The idea here is that communications provide forward guidance regarding policy stance and facilitate the convergence of heterogeneous market beliefs, thus explaining their success. However, and despite their effectiveness, there's some studies out there that show that oral interventions can exhibit limited success and can even trigger market volatility. So we would like to look at that and test if that might be the case or not in Colombia. So let me tell in Colombia and Mexico actually. So we're going to be looking at this in Colombia and Mexico, which are inflation targeting regimes with flexible exchange rate and discretionary foreign exchange interventions. There's some of the major FX markets in Latin America channeling approximately 41% of regional capital flows in recent years. We believe the importance of these markets in Latin America region extends the scope of our results and their relevance towards emerging market economies. Most importantly, they're countries where central banks routinely rely on oral interventions in order to steer FX markets, particularly in the case of Colombia. So the first thing we need to do is we need to define what we mean by oral interventions, because it's a relatively novel thing. Basically, it's statements or announcements related to FX markets. We gather, basically the way we get the data is we conduct queries through central bank archives and news reporting outlets, selecting statements and announcements related to FX markets. Statements are views or opinions made by monetary authorities about the exchange rate, and announcements are central bank press releases pertaining to foreign exchange intervention schemes. Monetary authorities include the central bank governors and board members, ministers of finance, and the presidents. That's basically our very specific measure of monetary authorities. And with that definition of oral interventions, or that measurement of oral interventions in mind, and for our study period, which goes from 2000 to 2019, we find a total of 193 oral interventions in Colombia and 35 oral interventions in Mexico. As you can see, the timing and intention of oral interventions depends on the exchange rate trends that reflect episodes of sharp depreciation or appreciation. So, for example, in Colombia between 2003 and 2005, when the Colombian peso was experiencing a significant episode of appreciation, that triggered a cluster of oral interventions aimed at weakening the local currency, which basically seeks to mitigate or contain or even reverse that trend. There's another cluster of interventions between 2011 and 2014 when the Colombian peso was at historically low levels, so the monetary authorities wanted to depreciate the local currency a little bit. In the case of Mexico, although we have less data relative to Colombia, we do have some periods of clustering. Particularly between 2014 and 2016, following negative shocks in oil prices, which affected the Mexican economy, there's a series of oral interventions that seek to strengthen the Mexican peso. So as you can see, these oral interventions depend on the macroeconomic context and on the trend that basically we see on the exchange rate. So what we want to do is we want to measure whether these oral interventions have an effect on the exchange rate level. And we're going to do so using the calendar time portfolio approach. This approach is widely used in the finance literature to analyze the impact of specific events, mainly mergers and acquisitions, on the long-term performance of financial assets. We basically use that approach here in this particular research question, and we believe it's suitable for answering our research question because it considers the incidence of known risk factors, which favors the identification of a causal effect. So I'm going to get into that later. So how this method works is it clusters oral interventions into events. based on their intended effect on the exchange rate, whether that's weaken or strengthen the exchange rate, so we separate them, and the time span between them, which we're going to call our parameter X. You can think of X as the number of days, so we're looking at daily data, that can pass between oral interventions in order for this to be considered part of the same event. The reason why we want to cluster these oral interventions into events is because different monetary authorities, as you saw, we have presidents, ministers, board members of the central banks, different monetary authorities might react to the same external shocks, to the same FX shock within a few days of each other. So even though you have different oral interventions, they're all speaking to the same event, so we want to take that into account. However, we're going to vary that with different values of our parameter X just to make sure our results are consistent. So we're going to assume that before any event, which is composed of oral interventions, an investor buys a portfolio worth a fixed amount of US dollars, and that the investor holds that portfolio throughout the event and for K days after the event. That's going to be our post-event testing window. And basically what we want to do is test if during this post-event testing window, there's any significant deviations on the exchange rate. And to measure those deviations, we're going to calculate the post-event portfolio returns based on daily exchange rate changes. So whether the exchange rate depreciates or appreciates, that basically tells us if the value of the portfolio goes up or down on every day on the post-event window. And we're going to compare that against the expected value of the portfolio return. So basically, our measure of the expected value of the portfolio return will be the average exchange rate C days before the event. So our choice for the counterfactual is based on the historical mean model, which yields similar results to the CAP-M or the FAMA French three-factor models, which are the standard methods used in the finance literature to estimate the counterfactuals in this type of methodologies. And once we do that, we basically look at the differences between the actual return and the expected return, which is going to be our measure of excess returns. And we want to test whether those deviations exhibit any statistical significance. However, and I think this is the main contribution of our study relative to other studies that have done the same in the literature, we're going to take into account the fact that there's risk factors that systematically affect the exchange rate. So we might have an event and look at the post-event window. However, there might be changes in foreign policy rates, sovereign risk, commodity prices. You just saw the case of Mexico and how that actually has an effect. We want to take those changes in the risk factors into account to reliably say that any residual effect can be related to these oral interventions that are clustered into the events. Basically, what that means is we're going to test the statistical significance of the estimated average excess return or the intercept in each of our regressions. Statistical significance of this intercept indicates that the events composed of oral interventions, in fact, affected the exchange rate level. So here's our main, here's a graph that summarizes our results. Let me get through the graph because there's a lot of stuff going on. We performed a total of 256 estimations, which varied in accordance with the parameters of our study, X, K, and C, and the intention of the oral interventions, whether that's weaken or strengthen the local currency, and of course, the country. We show you at the evidence for Colombia in blue and for Mexico in red, and we also have different levels of statistical significance. We show you the results at the 1, 5, and 10% significance level just to make sure that these results are reliable and consistent. So our main result is that we find an asymmetric effect of oral interventions on the FX markets of Colombia and Mexico. When we look at those that weaken the local currency, which are the ones on the upper panel, regardless of the value of our parameters, X, K, or C, we find that they systematically have an effect on the exchange rate and they have the intended effect. Remember that we're separating them based on that. We tried different values for our parameters of 2, 5, 10, and 15. Remember that X is the time span between oral interventions, K is the length of the post-event testing window, and C is the pre-event average exchange rate window. So we find that these results are systematic and across the values of the different parameters of our study. We find that that's the case, particularly in Colombia, but also in Mexico. However, when we look at oral interventions that show us the results when we look at those that strengthen the local currency, then the story changes a little bit. We see that for specific values of our parameters, then the number of statistically significant average excess returns on our estimations goes to 0, or basically there's mixed evidence. In the case of Mexico, we don't really find any evidence of statistical significance of oral interventions that support the local currency. And when we look at Colombia, we find some mixed results. Sometimes we find an effect, but most of the time we don't. And that's the reason why we say that oral interventions that support the local currency are occasionally effective. However, this is not a systematic result, and it wouldn't allow us to confidently say that they do have any effect. So in our study, we do try to provide some information about the mediating mechanisms behind these asymmetric results. And we came up with 2. We don't test them, but we provide some possible explanations. The first one, and this second one is actually a new one that we include just a couple days ago. The first one is market perception of fear of appreciation among monetary and economic authorities, which is this idea proposed by Levy-Ayari et al. 2013, which basically says that in emerging market economies, there might be a preference among monetary authorities and economic authorities more broadly towards depreciation in order to bolster economic growth through capital accumulation and savings. So as long as markets perceive or believe that that is the objective of these authorities, then oral interventions consistent with that objective will most likely have an impact. There's also the foreign exchange interventions that were actually conducted by the central bank during our study period, which suggests that in fact there's an inclination towards depreciation, because as well, I already showed some evidence of this before, but basically what the foreign exchange interventions that the Central Bank of Colombia conducted in the foreign exchange markets during our study period consisted of USD purchases, which should depreciate the local currency. And that's an important idea right here, because there's some evidence, Fratzer 2008 finds that the effectiveness of oral interventions increases substantially when coupled with actual foreign exchange interventions. So we're not only looking at oral interventions aimed at weakening local currency, but in that sense, there's these statements and announcements intended to weaken the COP in this case. That is not cheap talk. There's statements and communications that are being supported by costly actions undertaken by the central bank. Not only costly actions in terms of what it will cost you to buy these dollars, but also in the terms of the reputation and credibility of the central bank, because these interventions potentially have the effect to have spillovers towards monetary policy. So there's costly actions that bolster the credibility of these interventions, whereas there's nothing, well, not nothing, there's not really much evidence supporting the interventions that are aimed at strengthening the local currencies. And that's what we think might be going on, a clear preference towards depreciation and actually actions that reinforce that possible effect. So to summarize, we have provided evidence of an asymmetric effect of oral interventions on the FX markets of Colombia and Mexico. Of course, we do have more information for Colombia because we have been trying to look at the mechanisms. However, we hope to expand this to Mexico in the near future about the possible mechanisms in that particular setting. Oral interventions that weaken the local currency affect the exchange rate level, while those that support the local currency are occasionally effective. Our results are robust to changes in the main parameters of the econometric model, and our findings are consistent with previous studies on macroeconomic announcement and exchange rates. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andres. And now, Yannick, to make the comments.
Thanks very much for asking me to discuss this paper. Views, of course, mine, also for my presentation, and not those of the Fed. So what is this paper doing? Let me summarize very briefly. So it uses press releases issued by the Central Bank of Colombia and Mexico to study the effects of oral interventions on the exchange rate by creating an indicator variable whether the intervention is intended to depreciate or appreciate the currency. And then the result is well, the weakening of the currency is effective while the strengthening is not. So I think this is a quite neat contribution, but I think more meat needs to be added to the paper. So you use data from 2 countries, and I think, I mean, it's a good effort to go through all these statements and to identify which interventions are intended to weaken and strengthen. And I think you can actually also do a little bit more in terms of like describing it. You say you follow the Fratscher methodology, but I think it would be nice to kind of give some examples of like, how do you actually identify it? Like, give me a statement and say this is intended to weaken. And so what else do they try to do in these statements? Is it really only to weaken the exchange rate, or to strengthen the exchange rate, or is it also to stabilize financial markets in general, right? So I think that would be nice. So right now you use two countries for the and then you use like only the exchange rate on the left-hand side, basically, right? So of course, if you have only 2 countries, it's a bit difficult to exploit cross-sectional heterogeneity, right? So I think either you like go into more countries and then kind of try to exploit heterogeneity across countries, or maybe you can actually look at different types of outcome variables for these types of countries, especially if these intentions are not only to stabilize the exchange rate, but also do other things like stabilize financial markets. Yeah, so for example, you could look at some like bond yields or the stock market in general. And one other thing that I'm also going to do in my paper is to basically use like the whole cross-section of stock returns, and then you can see which firms are actually benefiting and which firms are harmed by the intentions of or by these oral interventions. And I think that would also allow you to test the mechanism a little bit. And so I think this is really really necessary. And then so I think then kind of more a bit on the conceptual side, I mean, you were discussing like what is the mechanism, what's really going on, and why are there so many intentions to depreciate the currency? If you just kind of go a step back and just, so in Colombia, basically it's the case that almost all of the interventions are intended to weaken the currency. And then you mentioned some reasons. So I think there you have to really discuss a little bit more why that is the case. And it would be also great to kind of test that and whether this is the case. Again, that would be easier to do if you had like a cross-section of countries, but maybe what you can do is also kind of look at like the time series variation. At what times do they intend to depreciate? What times do they intend to appreciate the currency? I mean, actually, I would have almost expected the opposite, because I mean, if you think of Colombia, for example, I mean, we know based on the DCP literature, actually, Colombia is a country where all exports are priced in dollars, right? So depreciation is not going to buy you that much. So why do they actually? Because exports are not responding, right? So why do they actually intend to depreciate the currency? We also know that Colombian firms and the government is borrowing a lot in foreign currency, so the depreciation is actually through the balance sheet channel going to harm. So to understand why is it the case, and then on the other hand also, I mean, we know a lot of emerging markets have built up reserves in order to kind of be more insulated from US monetary policy shocks and so on. So I would have expected that they actually kind of don't want to waste these reserves. So maybe what they're trying to do is actually use oral interventions to try to appreciate the currency because they don't want to waste the reserves, but then kind of use the FX interventions to depreciate the currency. So I think you could like study even with just these 2 countries, because you have the data on the actual FX interventions, like look at the complementarity or substitutability of oral interventions and the actual interventions, and like what is the decision to like orally intervene and depreciate, try to depreciate, or try to appreciate, or do you want to kind of use your FX reserves? Again, I would have expected that you kind of want to save your FX reserves and do that orally. But that seems to be a bit the case, and you mentioned that in the paper. That seems to be a bit the case in Mexico, but in Colombia that doesn't seem to be at all the case. And then, of course, also the question arises: why is it the case that the depreciation is effective, or the intent to depreciate is effective, while the intent to appreciate is not really effective? And I mean, I guess the first thing that would have come to my mind is kind of credibility, because, like, again, if you're a bit constrained by your FX reserves, you can always kind of follow with the actions on the one side, but not on the other side. So I think, like, also one other thing that you could do a bit better in the paper is, like, you could add some more descriptive statistics. How often do they actually do which action, and so on, and at what times. So yeah, I think that's basically it. So let me conclude. So the paper shows that all FX interventions are effective in depreciating the exchange rate, but not in appreciating the exchange rate. I think it's so far already kind of a nice and contained contribution, but I think, like, if you want to publish it in a good journal, I think you want to kind of broaden a bit the scope of the paper. It's also pretty thin at the moment, so I don't know. I think it's like, it doesn't have page numbering, so I'm not sure I printed it out. So, but it's yeah. So I think you can add a bit more meat. For example, by adding, you're looking at, like, cross-sectional variation in, for example, stock returns for each country, and then that would allow you kind of to look at the outcome variable in terms of the stock return, depending on certain characteristics of the firm. Well, good luck.
Thanks, Yannick, for your insightful comments. Now the floor is open for questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you. Just suggestions on how to explore more the data. I think it's very good data set you developed. So there's a good effort here, and you could try to, instead of exploring the cross section, try to, as the previous paper, explore the time series variation in policy credibility, or the cost of intervention, because there is, for instance, how costly it is to accumulate reserves at a certain point versus another. And so that's it, just a suggestion.
Okay, no more questions. So, Andres, please.
Thanks very much for that suggestion. That's something that we're definitely considering. So thank you, Yannick, for your valuable comments. They're very good. They're very good points. I'm going to touch on two of them, which I think it's worth discussing. We only have 2 countries. However, we did mention in the study that we actually gathered information for Peru and Chile, but we didn't see that the central banks of these countries use oral interventions in a way that would allow us to reliably conduct our statistical tests. So the data is very limited for these 2 countries. I know there's some colleagues from the Central Bank of Chile, so it might be, or even from the Federal Reserve of Peru. So that would be great to discuss with you guys later after this panel. We definitely want to extend this to the other countries. So Luis, the fact that you just advertise your data set is great. We We try to stick to countries that spoke Spanish at the beginning just because it was easier for us to do some initial assessments, but we're definitely thinking about including other countries on our sample, not only from Latin America, but maybe we could think about other emerging markets as well. So I think that's something that we definitely want to do in the future. Also, regarding other types of outcome variables, I think it's a great point. We are doing this as a short paper because actually the journal where we submitted the paper asked us to make it short as a short paper. Yeah. However, there's like a lengthier version of this. But I think there's other outcomes that we definitely want to look at because, for example, not only on our study do we find that there's a null effect of oral interventions that support the local currency. We found that, well, that's why it struck me, this result for call options in your paper. So we want to explore that a little bit. Maybe if we look at, I don't know, bond yields or volatility in FX markets, we would find something similar to your paper, Freddie, where, oral interventions that depreciate the local peso or the Colombian peso, Mexican peso, might lead to less market volatility, which is desirable, but the other ones, the ones that support, might create elevated uncertainty. So we definitely want to look at that with other outcome variables. I think this would also allow us to disentangle the mechanisms as well. So that is definitely worth looking at. So they're all great comments, very well taken. Thank you very much.
Okay, moving on. So let's go to our third panel. I'd like to invite Yannick to make his presentation, and Fred is going to be the commentator. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So this is joint work with Alex Rodniansky and Naoki Yago, who are both at Cambridge, and it's on intervening against the Fed. What do we mean by intervening against the Fed? Let me give you an example. So September 2022, on the 22nd, the Fed announced that it would increase interest rates by 75 basis points. And you can see here the exchange rate between the US and the Japanese yen. And you see an appreciation of the dollar, depreciation of the Japanese yen because of the increase of the interest rate in the US, as you would expect. A few hours later, you can see that the Japanese authorities intervened against the Fed and by selling US dollars and buying the yen. And you see that this intervention against the Fed was appreciating the Japanese yen quite considerably. So that's what we are interested in this paper. How effective is intervening against the Fed? What are the spillovers of US monetary policy? And can this intervention procedure insulate countries from the spillovers? How do we do that? Of course, it's very difficult to identify the effects of FX interventions. So what we do here is we use kind of a high frequency approach where we gather data from several countries on the daily level, and we try to understand whether these countries are intervening against the Fed. And so we use US monetary policy shocks at FOMC meetings, and then we consider whether countries intervene against the Fed by kind of doing the opposite of what the Fed was doing. So, and then we are studying first the exchange rate response, as you can see as here in the case of Japan. But then also we really try to understand what the mechanism is through which the US monetary policy shock affects these countries at the high frequency, and whether the intervening against the Fed, how it insulates or if it insulates the countries. And we do that by looking at the cross-sectional response of stocks, depending on several characteristics, especially those of the balance sheet. So here the idea is that a US monetary policy shock through kind of the balance sheet channel transmits negatively to firms that have US dollar debt, but then potentially through the FX intervention of the central banks to this counter-intervening, they can actually stabilize the exchange. And that's exactly what we find, kind of consistent with what many papers have shown and what we have already seen today. We see that when the Fed hikes unexpectedly and there's no FX intervention, the local currency depreciates and the stock prices of firms with dollar debt decrease. So this is really consistent with the traditional idea that there's this balance sheet channel. Firms that have US dollar debt, their net worth declines because of the depreciation in the exchange rate. Their net worth declines, so that has negative effects on the stock price. So we show that at the high frequency level, at the daily level. But then when we actually look at these firms that, according to our definition, intervene against the Fed, it's gone. Like, it's very effective. So you saw no effect anymore on neither the exchange rate nor on the stock price of firms without dollar debt, nor on the firms with US dollar debt. So this really suggests to us that this intervening against the Fed is very effective. We contribute to several literatures, I mean, the FXI literature, obviously, but then also the monetary policy literature, and how kind of intervening, or how it's possible to actually protect yourself against these spillovers. And then there's kind of the firm heterogeneity and international trade and finance literature. But so what we found a little bit unsatisfying in this literature is, of course, it's all done on the quarterly level. And as we all know, I mean, the shocks, they're much more effective, or they're much more powerful at like high frequencies, because so many things can happen if you add them up, or if you sum them at the quarterly level. So we really wanted to study this at the daily level to really understand what's going on, because we really think that this allows us kind of to understand the channels. But we still kind of contribute to this type of literature, of course, with the drawback that we cannot study real variables like investment, right? So that's, of course, the caveat that we have. So let me tell you actually which data we are using. We're exactly using this data that you were just advertising. So we use data from 13 countries. So we also don't have this huge cross-section. So we actually don't do a lot of cross-sectional heterogeneity across countries, but that's why we go to the firm level, right? So from 2000 to 2019, we have 4,000 firms, and the sample includes, I mean, mainly emerging markets, but also some advanced economies like Japan. So Japan actually hadn't intervened for a long time. So it was actually a nice example, because they hadn't intervened and then they suddenly intervened. So it was really unexpected, actually. So we get the data. It's actually quite a bit of work, because we download the data individually, mostly from the different, unfortunately, we don't have all the like kind of rules and so on available, but we have like the daily FX intervention data. And then we also constrain our data set to constrain our country sample to countries that intervene against the US dollar. Of course, there are some economies that are more kind of interested in the exchange rate against the euro, for example, and then we don't really include them, at least not in our baseline. And then we use very standard US monetary policy stock. We use Nakamura Steinson here, but we have also tried with others and seems to be pretty consistent. Then we use exchange rate and stock returns from DataStream and balance sheet data from Capital IQ. So still the question is, of course, like this FX intervention, even at this high frequency, is a choice, right? So and markets may already expect that. So what we are doing is we're estimating an FXI policy rule. We don't have this exact rule in place for every country, but we're estimating a rule kind of similar to a Taylor type rule, where we regress basically this counter intervention dummy on a bunch of observables that the markets may kind of also expect or have in the data set, and then we take like the residual and we use that as kind of the unexpected component of the FXI. So how do we define this counter intervention dummy? So if there's a contractionary shock of US monetary policy, and then the central bank sells dollars and buys domestic currency within 5 days after the shock, that's defined as a 1. And then the opposite is -1 if the central bank, if there's an accommodative shock and the central bank buys US dollars and sells domestic currency. And so this FXI variable, this counter intervention variable, we then regress on several characteristics. So the most important one is probably, that's what, at least what I thought, is like, so what is the average response of a country in terms of interventions when there's a monetary policy shock? So the market knows kind of, there's a contractionary monetary policy shock. On average, this country intervenes or doesn't intervene. So that's basically this beta CFF FFR. So that's the average for each country, how much it responds. So we interact kind of the monetary policy shock with the country fixed effect. And then, of course, the country fixed effect is not time varying. So we also have some other observable characteristics that are time varying, for example, GDP, the past trend, and volatility of exchange rates. And so we also try to understand whether these variables matter for counter-intervening. Let me show you kind of a variance decomposition for this counter-intervention. I mean, the big takeaway is like we actually don't explain much of it. So the 76% of the counter-intervention is not explained. So I mean, our results are very similar using the raw variable and this residual. But so you can see, for example, the biggest contribution is kind of the Fed funds rate interacted with some sorts of macro variables, which the most important one is actually whether they have intervened, have done this counter intervention in the past, which explains 35% of the explained variation. So overall, yeah, that's only 24%. So basically, we're using now this residual, which we call kind of the unexpected intervening against the Fed. Then first we go to exchange rates, just on the country level, and in a kind of very standard setting, we regress the change in the exchange rate between the day before the FOMC day and a few days before and a few days after on the Fed funds rate, and then we split the sample into those that can counter-intervene and then those that don't. We also have a specification where we kind of bunch both countries or both samples together, and then we estimate an interaction term. So here in column 1, we have the firms that do not intervene, that don't do the counter-intervention, while in column 2, we have the countries that do intervene. And you can already see that the coefficient is positive and statistically significant for the sample where there's no FX intervention, and it's basically 0 for those that do intervene. So that means a contractionary monetary policy shock depreciates the domestic exchange rate only for the countries that do not intervene, while if a country intervenes, there's no change in the exchange rate in response to a contractionary monetary policy shock. And so putting both samples together and then estimating the interaction term, you see the same thing. So the interaction term is exactly the same as the federal funds rate shock itself, just mirroring the results. Actually, let me show you the graphs, which are much nicer. So here, again, it's split between those that are not intervening and that are intervening, and you see like basically a flat line. So like they're on top of each other before the FOMC meeting. Then there's the FOMC meeting. This is a, this is 1 basis point contractionary monetary policy shock, and you see basically nothing for the countries that intervene, and you have the kind of the standard response of the countries that do not intervene. So you see like for the countries that do not intervene, let's say a 10 basis point contractionary monetary policy shock, which is around the standard deviation, leads to 2% depreciation, while again, nothing for the others. And so like then on the panel B, we plot the effect of the intervention, which is like going down, which means it's an appreciation. The effect of the intervention is an appreciation of the currency, right? Which is just the differential. Again, this is just cross-country, right? This is like 13 countries, and it's still high frequency, but it doesn't, there could be other things going on. So, and we are also interested in like, what are really the kind of real effects of it? How does it really affect the economy over and above the exchange rate? So for these two reasons, we go to, first we go to the stock market index, right? But then we would like to dig a little bit deeper and try to understand which firms are negatively affected by the contractionary monetary policy shock of the US, and which firms are actually insulated by this FX intervention. So what do? We do the same thing, but now it's just on the firm level. It's on the firm country level, of course. And so we exploit the response of stock prices in response to the monetary policy shock, and for firms that intervene and that don't intervene. And so you can now we split basically into 4 types of categories. We have first those that intervene and that don't intervene, and then we have we split into those firms that have FX debt and those that do not have FX debt. What is the idea here? Again, so of course the firms that have FX debt, a depreciation of the currency because of the contractionary monetary policy shock is going to reduce their net worth, and because of the reduction in their net worth, you would expect a reduction in their stock price. So let me just go to the graphs. So panel A is only firms with US dollar debt. And when you look at the red line first, you see this is for the countries that do not intervene. So you see a contractionary monetary policy shock leads to a very strong decline in stock prices for firms with US dollar debt. But almost no, a little bit of a decline for those firms for those firms with US dollar debt where the country does intervene. So you can see here the difference is huge between the countries that intervene and that don't intervene for the firms that have FX debt. When you then look at the firms that do not have US dollar debt, even for the countries that do not intervene, you don't really see a decline in the stock price. So actually, I think this is even kind of taking out the FXI results here. I think this is quite interesting because this really shows that the decline in stock prices you see in response to contractionary monetary policy shock is really only driven by the firms that have US dollar debt, which highlights that this balance sheet channel seems to be quite important, right? It seems to be maybe the most important. And without the balance sheet channel, you wouldn't really have the decline in stock prices. And then, of course, I mean, since there's no decline in stock prices anyway for the firms that do not have US dollar debt, the FX intervention is completely ineffective, right? So for these firms, it just doesn't matter. So there are really distributional consequences also of the FX intervention. So it really benefits the firms that have US dollar debt, which you can see in panel B, while it doesn't affect the firms that have no US dollar debt. We ran several robustness checks. Maybe one that I would like to highlight is that one concern here could be that US dollar debt, like firms with US dollar debt and firms without US dollar debt, of course, they can be quite different firms. So this is a choice to borrow in US dollars. These firms may be bigger. The managers may be different, all sorts of things. So to kind of more causally identify the effect, what we are doing is we are looking at the debt maturity structure of the US dollar debt that these firms have, and then we look at the firms that have disproportionately more US dollar debt maturing just after the US monetary policy shock. And we think that this is a more exogenous variation in terms of exposure to kind of the global financial cycle, and we see basically the same results. But since this is the last presentation, let me try to finish quickly. So what do we do in this paper? So we're looking at this phenomenon that we call intervening against the Fed, which is like when there's a contractionary monetary policy shock, countries intervene against the Fed by buying their domestic currency, by trying to stabilize their exchange rate. What are the consequences of this intervening against the Fed? It seems to be extremely effective in stabilizing the exchange rate. So countries that do the intervening against the Fed, they do not see a depreciation of their currency in response to contractionary monetary policy shock. They also do not see a decline in the stock prices in response to contractionary monetary policy shock. So that really leads us to conclude that the FX interventions can be an extremely successful tool in insulating yourself from the global financial cycle. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Yannick. I'm happy to hear that our data set is being used and useful. Freddie, please, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Let me, yeah. Second.
So, hello again. Yeah, I really enjoy reading this paper from Yannick. Has a great title. And let me start by saying that I really encourage to read the paper to the audience. So yeah, basically the paper, just summarize what the paper does. So basically the question that they're trying to solve is how does the interaction between the US monetary policies or prices and the FX intervention affect the exchange rate and also the stock prices for across firms. So their approach is basically they first estimate the US monetary policy shocks using high frequency methods. Then they estimate the expected component from the interventions using deviations from the policy rule that they estimate. And this is pretty standard procedure in literature. And finally, they measure the effects on the exchange rate and the stock prices using a novel event study and also a diff-in-diff approach. So their findings are the following. So when the Fed funds rate increases surprisingly, then if the central banks decide not to intervene, then the local currency depreciates and the stock prices also decreases for firms with US dollar debt. And with counter intervention, that is selling dollars, then the exchange rate and stock prices remain flat around the FOMC meetings. Well, again, just to recap very briefly the effects on the exchange rate. So again, effects on the exchange rate. So they're trying to measure the interaction between the unexpected U.S. monetary policy, a shock, and then with the foreign exchange intervention decision, and what are the effects on the exchange rate. So what they find again is if the Fed funds rate increases, then if the central bank does not counter intervene, the local currency depreciates. But conversely, if the central bank counter intervenes, the local currency depreciation is offset, and then there is a limited effect on the exchange rate intervention. And then regarding the effects on stock prices, they are trying to see what happens with the stock prices from the interaction of the US monetary policy shocks and the FX intervention. So the transmission channel here is the debt then denominated in US dollars. So when the Fed funds rate surprisingly increases, then if the central bank decides not to intervene, then the dollar currency depreciates. Not the dollar currency, the local currency depreciates, and there is an increase in the repayment of the local currency. And because of that, there is a reduction in the stock prices. And in contrast, if the central bank decides to intervene, then depreciation of the local currency is offset, and then firms with the US dollar debt are less affected. So yeah, this is like the story. So here you have like my first comment. So this is something that appears in the abstract as a finding. So without intervention, an unexpected Fed funds rate decreases the stock prices of firms whose debt is disproportionately denominated in US dollars. And I believe, if I understood correctly, that in order to say that they are using like an extensive margin approach in which they uses a continuous variable measuring the debt in dollars relative to total debt. So they say that if the dollar debt increases, the continuous variable increases in one standard deviation, then this has some consequences which is related to a decrease in the stock prices. So yeah, here my comment is I'm not completely sure that one standard deviation is reflects perfectly that you are referring to the disproportionately firms with disproportionately debt in US dollars. So here I have maybe two approaches in order to help give a little bit of punch to that statement. One approach is employ again the continuous variable of US dollar debt, but then use marginal effects in order to contrast the effects across the different points of the distribution of the US dollar debt. So you can contrast, for example, the effects on the 25th percentile versus the 75th percentile. And in that way, you are contrasting like the very right tail of the distribution. This is one comment. Then there is a second comment about another other potential transmission channel, and this is the currency risk exposure involved in firms that operate or in an international trade environment. So here, the importer firms, we know that the stock performance of import-oriented companies moves positively with the performance on the dollars, and in contrast, exporter firms, the stock performance of export-oriented firms tends to move against the dollar. So here would be really interesting if the paper expands a discussion on that front. And also, how the question is how to implement this empirically. Maybe a dummy of exporter or a dummy of recurrent exporter firm, and you include you do the same approach you are doing, but switching the debt in dollars for the exporter firms. And finally, I have some questions. So here you can see like the differences in effects of the exchange rate, and here I have a question, and the thing is, how can interpret the significant effects we are finding on the exchange rate before the FOMC meeting? So surrounding with a black circle, you see some significant effects, and my intuition is that maybe something is pushing, changes in the exchange rate apart, before the meeting. So maybe there are something, a confounding factor that has not been taken into account. So that's why you're finding these significant effects before the intervention. And finally, I have some questions here. So my question is, do you have information on firms that hedge their FX exposure? If this is the case, it will be really nice to include this covered in your specification, but of course, this might be limited in emerging markets. Then I suggest to expand the discussion. I suggest expanding a discussion about the pre-trend, pre-period balance coverage for the stock prices analysis. And the intuition is to make sure that the results are driven by not by any other differences in the firms exposed and not exposed to the exchange risk. Also, given the fact that you have interactions with industry where the firm belongs to, it would be very interesting to see a discussion about heterogeneous effects across sectors. And finally, there was a question that I had, and is, what criteria did you use to define the time window for the analysis, the 5 days? So why not 1 day or 3 days or 10 days? And what happens if you choose other windows? And that's my comments. And in conclusion, very nice and well-written paper, very important topic. Looking forward to the next draft, and thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Freddie, for the comments. And now, any questions? Okay.
Very nice paper, Yannick. Quick question. I think you might do it in the robustness from the quick flick. We had that slide, but I didn't understand why you go towards the extensive margin, basically, on interventions. Why not just do like a rule based on the amount, which would be way more natural?
Yannick, thanks a lot for the paper, great paper. I have two comments slash questions. The first one is you mentioned that these successful policies to weather this global financial cycle is a policy implication. You're looking at stock prices, but I'm thinking more like when I think of global financial cycles, all these financial conditions, including lending. Do you have any insights on that? How it's going to affect these type of channels on lending as well? And the other question is, okay, we started decades ago, these interventions were, okay, you shouldn't do that. And now, the literature is changing, these interventions are successful. And I'm wondering, like, what is really the policy implication here? Like, if everybody starts doing this, shouldn't be also US shouldn't also react to these type of intervention at the end if everybody is doing that? And at some point, what kind of equilibrium that we're going to converge? I mean, what do you think on that?
So, nice paper and nice results. And I have two questions. One is, it seems too good to be true when you look at the results and of the paper. So I'm trying to look for holes in the paper, which might be difficult. But one might be, for instance, the size of the monetary policy shock. Perhaps you're doing good on average, but on tiny shocks. And on the big ones, you miss. I'm not sure how, because it's an average effect. So perhaps separating on the important shocks and the lower shocks there might be something there. Another one goes in this direction of the policy implication, because it seems like whatever you do, you're doing right. So keep doing it, right? That's the policy prescription. You could read that. But it's not very, a central banker would ask, but what exactly is working and what is not? So some trying to differentiate what kind of interventions are really working and what are not. So for instance, rules-based, pre-announced. We have interventions that are announced and they go on for 6 months, and accumulation policies. So they're very different kind of a taxonomy of interventions. There's a lot of content that there, perhaps. So something to explore.
One more. So, I mean, maybe I'll do two things. One, comment on something that Serdar actually said earlier, and he just kind of was on the same line, and then building on that, making a comment for Yannick's paper. So first, I mean, great paper. It's really cool. So Geeta, if you remember Geeta's presentation 2 days ago, she had like a table that shows that if you have all the frictions, so there's 2 frictions in there, FX mismatches and high FX debt. So imagine you have both. Even in that world, the optimal response to a US monetary policy shock is not FXI, is actually domestic policy rate. Okay, so when we say for global shocks, FXI is the best response, it's only for non-fundamental shocks, so UIP shocks. So just to say that. So now on Yannick's, so Yannick is exactly looking at this problematic where the model, Geeta's model says you shouldn't intervene even if you have all the frictions and it's working. So I think like 2 things here. One is, did you look, I'm sure you're controlling for the local policy, what's happening to the local policy rate, but there could be like, you could almost do a horse race, right? You could have like a response function of the local policy rate versus this response function of the FX intervention, kind of see which one works. Because I mean, so that's Suggestion number one. And then suggestion number two, I mean, along the lines of Freddie's comment on the time window, because, I mean, it may work for 5 days, right? And I guess like my reading of the Japanese, I'm not an expert in what happened in Japan dollar rate like recently, but my impression is that actually then the yen resumed depreciating after that successful intervention, let's say. And then when they changed yield curve control, so they basically softened the yield curve control, which is a monetary policy response, then actually the yen really appreciated. And now it's more appreciated. But maybe this is just storytelling, but I think along the two, so policy rate and then window would be good.
Okay, one more.
Oh, one more.
Oh, thanks, Yanni. It's just a small point, actually. Great paper, by the way. When you study the stock prices, basically these are associated with portfolio equity flows. It will be interesting to look also at the debt side. Maybe you can look at the participation of foreigners in local markets, something like that. Probably you'll find in some countries the data with the right frequency. So that's it.
Wow, okay. Thanks a lot. These are super valuable comments. Thanks a lot, Freddie. Okay, let me see how I can structure that. So yeah, let's see. So okay, let me answer a few questions. So like I think I think what's super interesting would be to look at the importer versus exporter versus US dollar debt to kind of really identify what are the channels through which the US monetary policy shock spills over. It's much more difficult to get the data and it's much more scarce. I think we can try again. We already tried, and then we kind of gave up a bit on that. And then, on the FX hedging, I think that would be also super interesting. I also don't know how feasible it is to get that data. I think there's something available, but not everything. And then also, I think like the continuous variable, I think we can also look into that. I think we have it somewhere. I don't remember, somewhere in the appendix where we look at the continuous US dollar debt. And then, I mean, that also goes to Fernando's question on like we do kind of everything in terms of like dummies and not in terms of continuous variables. So why do we do that? I mean, I guess if you have the dummies, you can. I mean, I think the way I always kind of see this trade-off is when you use the dummy, you can really be specific about the dummy being zero, right? And you say like you have the dummy being zero, and then that's what happens, right? While if you use the continuous variable, you have to use the marginal effects, and you do not take into account the nonlinear effects because it's a continuous variable. So that's usually how I see the trade-off. And since we kind of find that it's really a precise zero for the dummy being zero, I prefer the dummy approach. So because then you make an assumption that the coefficient is right, like so I think that's but I mean we have it. I think we have it somewhere, and I agree with you. I mean we can put it back and maybe put a bit more emphasis, but like just to kind of give the rationale for both why we use the US dollar heterogeneity and then also the FX intervention in terms of dummies. And then, well, so stock prices are like, the most readily available things to do. I mean, we could also do bond prices, a bit more difficult. There's much less available. Then I don't know. So we can go to like quarterly, monthly frequency for like, I don't know, lending or like, more investment. But of course, then you kind of lose the power at the high frequency. I mean, again, it's also a trade-off. I think like Rui has done work on that, right? Like look at it at the quarterly frequency, but then you lose a lot, right? So you lose a lot of power, I think. So, and then, also thanks Rui for answering the equilibrium question because I have no idea how to answer it. So, yeah, no, I don't know exactly. I haven't thought about it. It's a great point. I don't know. I should think more about it. I don't think I can come up with an answer right now. Yeah, I mean, we have the local policy rate as a control, but yeah, I think we can look actually. I mean, that's maybe also going to your direction. We can actually look at what happens to the expectation of the local policy rate in response to the contractionary monetary policy shock, and yeah, we can also, we could look at other we can look at like corporate bond spreads and stuff like that that is available on the country level. But I think the nice part of the stock prices is that you can, I didn't even say that, right? But like we have the country times time fixed effect, and then we only, like even the country sector time fixed effect, and then you kind of exploit the variation across. So it's like, in terms of identification, it buys you a lot, right? So that's why I prefer it more. But yeah, we can certainly look at these other variables like corporate bond spreads and so on. Yeah, so I think like doing the horse race and see what happens to the local policy rate is a great idea. So then, yeah, I don't know what's not working. I don't know. I do robustness, but not unrobustness checks. Right? Like it's just, I mean, we have. I mean, yeah, I guess I don't know. I have to. Yeah, we can check. Like we can try to see if there anything where I agree. I think it would be nice to for policy as well to say like it only works in this kind of situation. So I think we did like size of the intervention. Where we kind of only look at the really big ones and then like take out the small ones, and maybe we can look at that as like you really have to have like a big intervention or something like that. But I mean, if you have any ideas, what else to kind of condition on, happy to chat more. But so far, yeah. All right. Although, yeah, the equity flows. I mean, I think like EPFR is like weekly data, right? So we could do that. I think that we wouldn't lose that much. Also, yeah, actually, then on the window, yeah, I mean, I agree, right? I mean, we're trying to push a bit like the macro implications. So I don't want to do 1 day. I mean, 5 days is a bit better, but we can move it out. And by the way, nothing would happen if we move it out 10 days, right? I mean, or like 3 days. It's all the same, right? The coefficient stays the same, independent of how long you make it for this particular day. It's just that, well, maybe like, I mean, I could imagine, I mean, the standard errors are going to increase, obviously, because then you have this other stuff going on, right? So then you have monetary policy decisions and so on going on. So then I could imagine that the standard errors are going to increase.
Yeah, sorry, but I believe you were comparing always with respect to the like the coefficient before, you know, like
so it's always like the stock price between T minus one and T plus K, right? And that is, of course, always the same.
Yeah,
right?
I see.
So,
yeah.
Right? So it doesn't change. Like, so, yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. It's very, very useful.
Well, with no further questions or remarks, and given that we are behind schedule, I would like to close this session, and thanks for our participants for this brilliant session. Congratulations.